This is ContraZoom, where we go back and forth about film. I'm your host, Dakota Ursino. The Hot Docs Canadian International Documentary Festival just concluded its 30th edition of its festival, celebrating the best documentary films from around the world, and ContraZoom is proud to have covered it for the fourth time. It's always a treat getting exposed to some of the best up-and-coming and established documentarians that show their films at the festival. On today's show, we're going to discuss several movies that we watched during the fest. Joining me for the very first time is Courtney Small. Courtney has written just about everywhere. He runs the publication Cinema Access, contributes to That Shelf, POV Magazine, and more. He hosts the podcast Changing Reel and is the co-host of the radio show Frameline. Welcome to the show, Courtney. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am very excited. Yeah, I followed you on Twitter for a while, and I always like reading your work. You're such a thoughtful critic, and so I'm very happy that we can talk some documentaries today.
Yes, and with Hot Docs, there's always no shortage of interesting films to talk about.
How long have you been attending or covering Hot Docs?
That's a good question. I want to say, man, it's been so long. I don't even remember my first. I want to say it's probably been about a decade.
Okay.
Maybe even longer because the pandemic made us forget the concept of time. But I'll say at least for a decade I've been going. It was one of the first festivals, at least in Toronto, that I got accreditation for as a critic early on when I was just starting out as like a vlogger, and they've always been really good to local writers. They've really done everything they can in terms of like not only just giving accreditation, but also helping you locate links if you can't make a particular screening or whatnot. So I found that it's been a very welcoming and encompassing film festival, which is great.
I would absolutely agree with that. I believe that they were also the first festival to accredit me as well. So yeah, I'm glad we have a similar feeling for that. Now, obviously, because you contribute to POV Magazine, which its specialty is documentaries. Is there a reason other than that draws you to the festival, whether it's either the selection or the actual atmosphere itself? What about Hot Docs makes you keep coming back?
I guess first and foremost, it's the films. If you really think about it, documentaries are vital to cinema. They're a really unique way of telling stories, but I don't think they get the same amount of love that they really should. More people and even critics talk more about fiction and obviously the big budget studio driven stuff, whereas Hot Docs is just such a unique film. Like, you learn so much from a lot of these stories because again it's nonfiction, but also even the way how some of these stories play with the narrative structure, and some kind of blur the lines. Like, I remember seeing The Imposter years ago at Hot Docs, and just the way how it used reenactments to almost kind of blur the line between a documentary and a narrative drama was like really fascinating. And also, if you get the chance to actually go and be amongst the people, it's just a really friendly atmosphere because they have like discount pricing for students and seniors. So if you go during the daytime, there's just a lot of people that love cinema that are just out willing to talk about what they've seen and what they're looking forward to. So it's just a really friendly atmosphere and just a unique selection of films. So you're always going to walk away with one or two films that you'll be thinking about later on in the year.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's tough because you look at every year when the slate of movies comes out and you're like, okay, so which ones are going to catch my eye here? And I know you had told me you had seen several of the documentaries that are playing the festival at Sundance earlier, so you had a bit of a leg up there as far as recognizing titles. But for the most part, I feel like a lot of the time, these are movies that are sort of fresh to the world, and you're just looking at it, be like, okay, so what am I interested in this year? What's sort of going to be my own personal thesis of the type of movies I'm going to look at? And it could be a little overwhelming at first. Do you ever sort of have that struggle when you're trying to decide what to watch?
I have that with every single festival that I go to. So my approach to film festivals is slightly different than most. I'll have one or two, I really gotta try and see that if I can. And then I have a large selection of let me just take a chance on something. So something, this sounds kind of interesting. This is a really cool photo in the program book, or I have no idea what this film is about, but it fits in my time slot. And that's how I kind of approach film festivals. And this year for Hot Docs, I had particular ones that I was covering for POV. So those were kind of like the I must see. And then a lot of it was just kind of throw your arms up in the air and where it falls. Like I find, especially with Hot Docs, since, as you said, a lot of these are fresh to the world films, I figure you can't go wrong. You just take a risk. Even if it's played Sundance, Sundance is not a guarantee that it's going to be great. It's just it got into Sundance first. So, there's a couple of documentaries that played Sundance that were award winners that are playing Hot Docs that I was not fond of. But, it's just how it goes. So I like to keep an open mind, and I always recommend to people, even if you're not like a big cinephile, go to a film festival and at least try and see one film. Doesn't have to be a big name, whatever. Just try and see one, because that experience of just experiencing something new really opens the floodgates, and like you'll want to approach it that way moving forward.
There's almost something really nice about being able to watch a movie before anyone else has seen it, so you don't have any sort of preconceived notions or hearing chatter about it, or is this movie good or bad, or debates that are raging and things like that. And you can almost appreciate it for its freshness to you, because you're just a blank slate going in.
Yeah, and there are times where the debate can change your mind in a negative way. Like, I'll use, it's not a documentary, but I'll use The Joker as an example. Yes, it's a big budget film and whatnot, but I remember seeing it at TIFF and I was like, okay, enjoyed it, what have you. It's got its flaws. But then the nonstop debate and discussion that was going on about it, and the think pieces, by the time the festival ended, I was just like, I don't want to hear anything about Joker. I don't want to see it ever again, just because I'm exhausted by the conversation. Like I like being able to experience new things and, champion things that moved me in a particular way. Like sometimes we don't need to analyze everything, even though I'm saying this as a critic. There are times where there's certain things where it's like, okay, we are putting way too much energy into something that isn't worth it, especially when it comes to like those big budget titles, whereas there's these great smaller films, there's these great documentaries that I wish we'd put the same amount of interesting discourse into.
I think that's a pretty good way of putting it. Yeah, I absolutely understand what you mean there. All right, well, we're here to talk about some movies that we saw. There's two movies we both saw, and so we're going to lead off with those ones, and then after that, we're going to go back and forth and just highlight some films that we saw that were either interesting or good, or just feel that we want to have a little bit of a discussion about. But yeah, so the first one we're going to talk about is a film called Satan Wants You.
Joining me now from Victoria is Michelle Smith, a one-time victim of abuse by a satanic cult, and Dr. Lawrence Pasder, the psychiatrist who helped her come to terms with that nightmare.
The book is called Michelle Remembers.
Michelle Remembers. We wrote it together.
It's the first publicized account of such rituals.
They would put me in cages, sacrifice animals.
Eating feces and orgies and dismembering fetuses. These were things that you experienced.
That's right.
Who are these people?
Well, they're a secret organization. They're a secret society.
And that is directed by Steve J. Adams and Sean Horler. I'm just going to read the IMDb logline because it's probably the easiest way to describe it. It tells the story of how the satanic panic of the 1980s was ignited by Michelle Remembers, a memoir by a psychiatrist and his patient. The book relied on recovered memory therapy to uncover Michelle's abduction by baby-stealing Satanists. Now, that is quite the logline, if you ask me.
That log line alone should be enough to sell tickets.
Yes. And it's sort of funny because now that after I watched that, I started following the directors on Instagram and in the film on Instagram, and it seems to be already getting the buzz that I think this movie is definitely going to be getting throughout its run. It's playing at some other film festivals, and already you can see that there's some excitement going on, being like, okay, what is this movie? And this was absolutely fascinating. This was recommended to me by Rachel, and she's like, you got to watch this one. And so I was like, okay, sure, yeah, no problem. This is a bit of an interesting title. And I'm not old enough to have experienced the satanic panic. I was born at the end of the 80s, so I miss kind of all of this. But I've definitely seen enough news programs along the years to remember, how things like heavy metal or Dungeons and Dragons were completely vilified as being a gateway to Satanism. And that's how young people were, being anti-establishment as they were doing these things and hailing Satan, all this sort of stuff. And looking back now, you just kind of roll your eyes and laugh. You're like, do you not realize how ludicrous all of this sounds? And you watch this movie and it's just absolutely shocking how I'm almost at a loss for words of how a single book was able to change the discourse. You were just talking about Joker and how many think pieces and how everyone had to have an opinion on this movie. I feel like Satan Wants You in this memoir that was written, Michelle Remembers, is that exact same thing from the early 80s. And it just was so crazy to see how it was literally like a wildfire. Once this thing spread, it couldn't be stopped. And then you're watching more and more of these TV shows, the daytime talk shows like the Sally Jesse Raphaels and the Oprahs and the Geraldo Riveras, the clips that they show during this movie. And just seeing the insane things people were saying and like grown women being like, yes, I was kidnapped by Satanists and forced to give birth and I had to sacrifice my firstborn child. And it's like, did no one stop to think of how ridiculous this all was? What were your thoughts on watching this movie? And do you have any sort of memories of reading or learning about the Satanic Panic?
Well, first I want to give you credit because this was one that I couldn't get to. I was thinking of maybe going to the last screening, but then I just couldn't fit in my schedule. And then you had mentioned that you really liked this one. So I made the effort to track it down. And I want to thank you for that. So it was, Rachel mentioned it to you and now you're paying it forward. So I'm going to try and pay it forward to someone else to see this film because I think it's great. I was really young when I guess this was occurring in the 80s. So I don't have any memories of this. I do remember as I was maybe I guess in my teens hearing stories about I think it was Alice Cooper biting a head off a bat and, links to heavy metal and Satanism, but it was never anything that really kind of stuck in my memory. One of the things that I find fascinating about this film is when you were saying like, you found it shocking that people would believe this. I kept thinking about while I was watching it, the way how capitalism really propels this. Capitalism and fear are powerful drugs, if you really think about it. Because in this film, you have, yes, this one book, this woman recounting these memories she claims to have had, but even how the memories are pulled from her over, I think it was like a 4-year process of this type of therapy that really, I would say, crosses the line in terms of patient doctor care. And people didn't really question because it played into their fears. There is this great evil, especially if you're a Christian, you're always, trying to be on the right path, not fall on the path of Satan, what have you. But then when people start to realize they're making money off of this, like they're becoming celebrities, you start seeing other psychiatrists now trying to employ these methods or these techniques, and they're starting to get even more money from insurance companies because they're having more and more clients doing this. And it made me think a lot about our current state and how back then it was people read this one book and everyone read this book. Now we have social media, and there's a lot of people on social media that play with fear, cultivate fear for their own financial gains and their own popularity. And a lot of people will start spreading stories, or like I've gone to dinner with people that have said, have you heard about such and such? And I'm like, what? And clearly it was something that got started on the internet that they're believing is real because everyone else is talking about it. And the person who started it is making mad money, So it was really fascinating to see how society doesn't really change. We don't learn from the past. We just find different ways and different, I guess, tools to use the same type of grifts from the past and bring it into today.
Yeah, and I think very specifically, this movie does a great job of sort of connecting this through line of what was happening 30, 40 years ago to what is happening in modern society, specifically with the use of social media, and they connect it to things like QAnon and what's happening in the United States with the the alt-right political movement, and it's the exact same tactics that they were using then that they're using now. And so it was really fascinating to sort of see how you can connect the dots from A to B and get to where we are today.
And one of the things I also liked about this film is, as they're diving into Michelle, the woman that claimed that she was given to a satanic cult at a young age and spent 14 months with them, and they're digging into her life and her psychiatrist's life, who ends up writing this book with her. There was a lot of questions that I had that the film eventually answers, but when you're watching it, you think, why didn't anyone have these particular questions? Like, if this child was gone for 14 months and you're interviewing her sister, didn't anyone talk to the sister at the time and say, where was she was she at home for 14 months? Did anyone go to school and say, hey, did she hand in any assignments during this particular time when she shouldn't have? Like, there was just, people were just so consumed. And even how you see the police and the media especially start buying into it. They don't really question because, well, everyone's talking about it, so we need to talk about it. Everyone's panicking about it. Oh, so we need to start arresting people, because if we don't, then they're going to say we're not doing our jobs. It's just this way how fear propels everyone to just abandon any form of logic or protocol. Yes. Just because, mass hysteria is happening. So you want to be on the side of mass hysteria because you don't want to be called a doubter or a Satanist. One person said, if you didn't agree with them, they immediately called you a Satanist. And, we have that in our thing today. You don't agree with someone, they call you're a political whatever, you're this, you're that, you're woke, whatever foolish terms they use. And no one stops to go, well, this is a simple question. Was she at school?
Yes.
Did anyone who knew her all these times say, hey, this period she was acting a little weird, or where are there scars? Were there scars on her body back then? Like, it was just simple questions that people don't want to ask because they're happy to be caught up in the hysteria of, well, if everyone's freaking out about it, I need to be freaking out about it as well.
Yeah. I think the documentary does a pretty good job at that, because as you were saying, you're watching this movie and a logical, rational person will start immediately coming up with a list of questions in their head. I mean, like, okay, what happened with her at school? How come her siblings didn't say anything? Okay, what else was going on at the same time? All these sort of things that are, you don't need to be a police detective to figure this sort of stuff out. You can ask very simple questions of, was she at school at this time? And I think the film, as you said, does eventually answer those, but I think it takes its time a little bit, almost to its detriment, to the point where there's a couple times where I'm like, okay, I kind of need some answers here. We're running out of time. And in due time, they do reveal all this sort of information. It's sort of right at the very end where they're just like, oh yeah, and by the way, here's all the answers you want, after we spend the last hour and a half kind of dancing around it and talking more about the philosophical implications of the questions you're asking, but not giving you the actual answers you're requiring. So the directors do a very interesting job, I think, of kind of dancing around it a little bit, almost teetering on the edge of making us wait too long, but we do get the information we require. Do you sort of feel similarly to that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I had several questions about Michelle and what happened to Michelle at a certain point, where they eventually explain it, but it does take a long time to get there, because there were certain questions that you would still, I think, had the same kind of impact, the same level of suspense and paranoia that the film kind of plays in, while still letting us know a bit more, because they're talking to people like her sister, the doctor, his ex-wife, I think it was his daughter, and some other people. And I was like, okay, but I need to know a little bit more about where are these people now, or what happened to them, and how were they able to, have this kind of patient-client bond that turned into this media tour, which turned into something else. And no one really mentioned the fact that the turning into something else is a huge deal. But it was just kind of one of those things where they mention it and I was like, what? And then they kind of toy it out, they draw it out, and then they explain their theories, and the film ends. And it's like, oh, but there's a whole other interesting aspect in between them becoming celebrities and that something else occurring that really need to be explored. But again, I guess there's only so much you can put in, and even the whole tying it to modern society, it happens like in the last, I would say, 10 minutes, even though my brain was making the connections from like the 20-minute mark of the film.
Yeah, I agree. I do like what they did overall. I'm very high on this movie, and it's probably going to be one that I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the year and sort of following along and hoping that it gets a wide release and seeing how it does at different festivals, because it was a very exciting documentary, and they do some very interesting stuff. There's a little bit of reenactment, but it's not really reenactment stuff. It's sort of they use it as an excuse because they have the actual audio tapes from their therapy sessions, and they play them, and they're actually quite horrifying to listen to at certain points, because Michelle is, really distraught and wailing in pain and screaming out these horrific things she thinks she's feeling. And so we get this sort of reenactment where we see the therapist and the patient sort of in the traditional, on the armchair laying down sort of thing. But we don't really see the faces of the actors playing them. So I think that's a useful tool to sort of visualize the audio that we're hearing.
Yeah. It's stylistically, I think it's really well done. I liked how they incorporated those reenactments with the therapy sessions, with also archival footage, and as you said, the audio recordings are done in a really chilling way that kind of plays up the whole Satanism aspect. And then again, as things start to unfold, you look at those recordings and how it's presented slightly different, because it's presented the way that the book wants you to believe it occurs, and then as you start to realize how these memories are brought about, it really does force you to look at its presentation in a unique way, just like how you're supposed to look at the book with a different set of eyes now than they did back in the 80s.
Yes, absolutely. All right, I think that was a good little discussion we had there. I think we'll move on to the next film that we both saw, and that was July Talk, Love Lives Here.
July Talk is back.
Billed as Canada's first post-lockdown show
at a drive-in movie lot.
It's pretty intense trying to figure out how to do this and not be financially ruined.
If there's a health emergency on stage, none of this work is worth anything.
And so July Talk is a pretty prominent Canadian rock band. I'm sure anyone in Canada has probably heard them in passing on the radio, perhaps, or maybe seen them live. And right when the pandemic started, the band was prepping the release of their third album. And obviously, when the world shut down, their tour shut down, all that sort of thing. And so they had to figure out a way of how to present their new music to the world and sort of stand out from everyone else that was also trying to release music. And so they decided to do some drive-in shows just outside of Newmarket, Ontario, which is about 40 minutes north of Toronto. And they did 2 nights at a drive-in. So everyone was able to literally drive their car in, and you're in your own little bubble there, and you tune in the radio station like you do when you go to a drive-in movie theater, and you can hear the band and see them play. And they utilized all 3 screens at this small drive-in, so that way you basically had a 360 view of no matter where you're parked, you're at least facing one of the screens. And what was, I think, most interesting was I was actually at these concerts. I was at the first night of this show. So this was why this movie was pretty high up on my list. I quite like the band July Talk, and I was at that show. But I'm curious, what drew you to this one, Courtney?
You know what? This one, I didn't know anything about July Talk. So it was more just I wanted to learn a bit more about them. It sounded rather interesting. And again, as I said, one of those kind of just take a leap of faith and see what happens kind of picks. But I'm actually very interested to hear your thoughts on how it was presented, considering that you saw it live.
I will say, as a concert documentary, or at least the way it's being billed as a concert documentary, I was a little disappointed by the footage that they chose to show us. I unfortunately sort of thought that they spent too much time recounting how they formed, which I thought was all interesting, and getting to see early band footage was certainly fascinating to see, seeing them play in small venues, because every time I've seen them live, they've been on big stages. Like I saw them at Scotiabank Arena, and I've seen them at festivals and things like that. I think by the time I saw them at this drive-in show, I think was the third or fourth time I'd seen them live. And then there's, a whole bunch of stuff about them going into their ethos and what I'm sort of going to call the band's manifesto and how they're seeing all that. And then also one of the lead singers, he's in the process of being diagnosed with diabetes. So there's this whole health scare aspect that's going on. And then one of the band members has a COVID scare because his wife ends up testing positive like 2 days before the show. And then there's all this stuff with the backing singers and how they want to make them more prominent and give them more of their due at their live shows and stuff like that. And all of this is sort of wrapped in while they're trying to do this planning of actually putting on these live shows, which I imagine was quite difficult to do. It was right at the start of the pandemic, and you're trying to figure out how to put on a concert when you basically have to start from scratch because everything is completely different. And then we also get footage of the concert. And so for me personally, as someone who went to the show, I was most interested in seeing the actual footage because I was there sitting in the car with my wife and my friends, and the four of us went and we're watching the show, and it was a great time, had a great time. But, I kind of wanted to see the actual show itself and sort of how it all came together in the end. And we basically sort of get snippets of about 3 or 4 songs, and it's not like when I think of great concert documentaries, I'm thinking of like the band The Last Waltz, where it's basically just the concert, or anything the Talking Heads or David Byrne has done, and sort of this, pantheon of great music documentaries. And I just felt like, while everything they covered in the film was interesting, they covered too much. How did you feel about it all?
See, I'm actually the exact opposite.
Okay.
And I think the reason why, and maybe it's because I don't have close ties to the band, but I'll use the example of, I don't know if you ever saw the Metric documentary that, the name is eluding me right now, but the band Metric had a concert doc a few years ago. I think it played Hot Docs. But anyway, that one was a lot of what you were kind of looking for, some behind the scenes stuff, but it was just a lot of concert footage. And the footage that they showed was okay, but it didn't really capture the feel, because I've been to a Metric show. I know the type of energy that happens. And then some of the song choices that they chose is like, well, why would you choose that? So I actually like the fact that, having not knowing the band July Talk, I was actually more interested in all the other stuff. Like I like the fact that I only got 3 or 4 songs, and the 3 or 4 songs was presented in such a way because there was enough story around them that I was more engaged in those particular songs, instead of just like you're showing me 15 different sets or 10 different sets of songs. Like I actually was more engaged in the 4 because I was more invested in the band's evolution to this point. And just the idea of being in the pandemic and having to put a concert on in a drive-in, you go, okay, that's smart. But then like it could still become a super spreader event by people simply going to the bathroom, or as you see in the footage, there are some people that are sitting outside their cars on lawn chairs. Like there's so many ways that this thing can go wrong, especially at a time when we still weren't quite sure how things are spreading. And I found that interesting. And then the fact that you've got this whole type 1 diabetes threat. There's a great scene halfway through where the co-lead singer has to check himself. And any other time you wouldn't even think about it. You're like, oh, he's taking a break. It's like, no, he's worried about his health, because even though they're worried about everyone else's health, he also could endure serious injury to his own body by performing this, because it was still very early on in his diagnosis. And I really found the stuff with the backup singers interesting, because it almost kind of came up by fluke. Like when they wrote that particular song, they were trying to talk about a systemic problem in the industry before the entire world started talking about systemic racism and systemic issues. And then the whole, well, do we release the song? Because now it looks like we're just kind of jumping in to cash in on a movement like, Betty Crocker or whatever these other companies, or do we continue with what we originally planned? And also, this whole album is going to be different than what people are used to. So I found all of that really fascinating. So I was a little more engaged in it, partly because even though they bill it as a concert doc, I didn't get the typical concert doc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's completely fair. Like I said, I think all the stuff that they do tackle was very interesting. And for the most part, I think they gave enough room for all these stories to breathe and unfold naturally. It's just, I felt that they tried to do too much. And it just sort of felt a little ADD at times of like, okay, now we're going to jump over here. Now we're going to jump over here. Now we're also going to throw this storyline at you. And it just sort of felt like it was a lot of information to process.
Yeah, I can see that. I could definitely see that. I feel that because they gave me so much, it just offered me other avenues to look at the band, opposed to just being like, oh, they're this high energetic punk band that's now focusing a little more on the songwriting craft and the melodies. And I was, oddly enough, I was thinking about the Red Hot Chili Peppers because I saw an interview with Anthony Kiedis, I can't remember where, and he was talking about the evolution of the band and how they were playing, they didn't even know how to like play, but they were just kind of jamming and created this sound. And then as they got older, they started to evolve and really start working on their craft as singers and performers. And I kind of like getting those little insights into artists. And again, if it's a band I've never heard of, and I'll put this stipulation for any documentary, I need to know why you feel like this subject is interesting, or why someone found this subject interesting enough to tell. And I think the pandemic concert is a good entry point, but there was just aspects of this band that, again, I had not known of that I was like, oh, that's actually quite interesting. There's a lot more avenues to July Talk than I would have probably guessed had I just seen like a kind of straightforward concert film.
I think that's totally fair. And maybe it is my closeness to the band. I don't know them personally. I've never met them. But having seen them several times and followed along their career since their first single, I'm pretty aware of their history and what a July Talk concert looks like, especially having gone to several of them and sort of seeing all that. And maybe my closeness actually hinders my ability to appreciate it, because I almost wonder, when I wrote a review about it, I almost feel like if you're a big fan of July Talk, you're probably going to find some of the insights very interesting, specifically their rehearsal process and their approach to putting on a show. I think that stuff is just very interesting from a sort of a technical standpoint. And really, I think any sort of music lover would sort of appreciate what does a rehearsal look like? When you watch a show or you see videos of show and you see the singer do banter with the crowd, how much of that is rehearsed? How much of that is pre-written? All that sort of stuff off the cuff. What's the formula for that? And seeing how they're sort of scripting out their show and how they want the beats to hit at different moments, I found it was very interesting to look at. And so I finished my review by saying, I wonder if non-fans of the band will be able to access this documentary in a way that fans of the band will. And so it's very interesting to sort of hear your thoughts on this as someone who's never really listened to them before or heard of them before and was able to sort of connect with this movie on a much deeper level. So I find that very fascinating.
Yeah, I think it just works. And the part with the rehearsing I also found really interesting, and not simply because of a pandemic, they can't do the impromptu stuff anymore, but it was just something as simple as they do a rehearsal and then they do a rehearsal as if it was the real show. And I always, because often when you see concert documentaries, you see the band rehearsing and stuff, and they're stopping to pause and, mic check the sound levels and what have you. But just the idea of that is only the first rehearsal that we see. This band does like a full out sweaty, this is the show, we don't stop and that's just rehearsal. Like
Yeah.
when you think about it, you're like, of course, I'm sure a lot of bands do that, but it just never crossed my mind that they would rehearse at that level. So you're bringing that same energy in the afternoon, and then a couple hours later, you have to come back and build yourself up to do that energy, and then you're doing 200 to 300 shows a year. Like it's quite fascinating to think about. But again, I think if it was a band that I was invested in, that I've seen, like I'll use the Metric as an example, but if it was like, I don't know, if it was the New Pornographers or Arcade Fire, bands that I've seen several times live, I would probably have a different view of it. I'd probably want to see more of the concert footage, and like the good concert footage, the stuff that is ingrained in my mind from those shows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, it was a very interesting documentary, and I'm definitely curious to hear more people talk about this, because I'm very curious to hear different people's perspectives on this one. Would you say now, after watching this movie, are you more inclined to check out their music?
I actually did listen to a couple of their albums after seeing the film. I don't know if I would consider myself a fan of theirs. I do, but again, I only listened to 2 albums. I haven't listened to like their full catalog. So I enjoyed what I listened to, but it wasn't enough to be like, oh yeah, I want to really dive in. But I was more intrigued by it after seeing this film. Okay,
that's fair. All right, we are now going to get into the portion of movies that only one of us saw. So I'm gonna lead us off here, and the first one I'm gonna talk about is a film called "I'm Just Here for the Riot," which was directed by Kathleen Jamie and Asia Youngman, and it is a part of the ESPN 30 for 30 documentary series. And as a sports fan, the 30 for 30 is basically the gold standard, the absolute pinnacle of what modern sports documentaries are. They've produced some of the most fascinating insights of the most well-known sports stories, the unheard of ones, and the controversial ones. And they do such a good job at hiring the right directors to do deep dives on the story. And this one in particular is about how in 2011, when the Vancouver Canucks lost the Stanley Cup to the Boston Bruins, the city of Vancouver rioted. And as a Canadian, whether or not you're a hockey fan or not, I think basically everyone knows about the story of sort of what had happened. And so it's very fascinating to watch this, because the movie starts out as basically a play-by-play of how the events unfolded, using a mix of news footage, because obviously you're covering the Stanley Cup, so there's a lot of news crews on scene. And this was right at the start of smartphones, so a lot of people suddenly had cameras in their pockets for the first time. And as we sort of saw in different places around the world, think of stuff like the Arab Spring that was happening in Egypt and other countries, where Twitter was basically the first time we were seeing real footage in real time. And it was basically the same thing over here. And it does get compared to other places around the world where there are civil unrest, and it sort of mocks Vancouverites for rioting over something as trivial as a sports game, when there's actual issues around the world, like, authoritarian dictatorships happening and people being murdered in the streets and all this sort of stuff, and how quaint it all sort of seems. And so it starts out giving us a nice play-by-play of how this all sort of happened and what they believe was the inciting incidents of everything. And then the film sort of morphs into a philosophical debate of what is the difference between a mob mentality and mob justice. Because obviously when a riot starts, especially with something like this, you get a mob mentality. One person, throws a brick, and suddenly someone else says, hey, I can throw something too. And then someone tries flipping over a car and people join in. And before you know it, you've got a large scale riot. That's how these things work. And so they're delving into the sociology of what mob mentality is. But then the after effect was the start of social media. Everyone was posting photos and videos of the rioters. And then it became a quote unquote witch hunt of trying to name and shame everyone that was involved in this. And when that started, it started out in a very, I believe, honest way of doing it, of like, hey, these people committed crimes. There was a lot of them. If you know any leads, you know, you should probably speak up about this. But then it became people sending death threats and people hoping the family members of these people would get harm. And, you know, someone stealing some clothes deserves the death penalty, and you know, things that are way out of proportion for what the crime was. Do I believe, you know, justice should have been served, and people that, you know, broke into businesses and destroyed personal property, should they have been prosecuted and given sentences? Absolutely. I don't think these people should have been killed for doing these things, because, you know, the punishment does not fit the crime in this sort of circumstance. And so it becomes, it starts out as a sports documentary, and then it turns into a philosophical debate. And they do a great job because they interview several people that were actually arrested for participating in the riot and sort of getting their thoughts on it. And so it was all just very fascinating. And once again, you know, huge kudos to ESPN for being able to greenlight this. And then the two directors, Kathleen Jamie and Asia Youngman, for being able to capture everything that they were able to do, get the interviews that they did, show the footage that they did, all this sort of thing. And Kathleen Jamie, I saw her last film, The Grizzly Truth, which was also another Vancouver sports documentary about why the Vancouver Grizzlies left the city and sort of the black hole it left in sports fans out there, and how it went. And so there's so many touches to that movie that I see in this one. So it was a great one. If anyone's a hockey fan, I think you'll be very interested in it, but I think it sort of supersedes sport as a whole once it gets into the moral debate of it all.
No, that one sounds very interesting. It's funny because I did see The Grizzly Truth and Jamie's other one. I think it was like Finding Big Country, and she seems to have a really good grasp of how sports and I guess the emotional connection that people have, whether it be logical or irrational, how it really like shapes generations. So this one sounds really fascinating.
Yeah. If you've seen Grizzly Truth and searching for Big Country, you'll definitely see the similar overlaps that she does. You know, the things like building a set to sort of conduct interviews with the artifacts of the subject around the person, so you feel very immersed in it. Mm-hmm. My only real complaint of this, you know, I'm going to try to be objective about this as much as I absolutely love this movie, is I felt like they spent a little bit too much time speaking with law enforcement people, especially since they sort of inadvertently point out that the police just weren't really doing their job at the start of the unrest before it turned into a riot. You know, after the Canucks lost the game, you know, there were drunk people getting mad and, you know, yelling at people, and little skirmishes started breaking out. And you see footage of this, and the police are just standing there, you know, 5, 6, 7 deep, watching, you know, two guys fighting each other, and they do nothing to separate them. And then from that fighting, you know, someone throws something, and they don't do anything to step in there. And then before you know it, it's obviously too late, and then you have to bring in the riot team and all this sort of stuff. And you're interviewing the police behind it, you know, the police chief at the time, and several people that worked the event, and, you know, they all talk of themselves as heroes and how they saved the day and all this sort of stuff. And, you know, I think now as a society, it's a lot easier and safer to be a critic of policing as a whole, and realizing when they are not doing their job and when they're not doing their job properly, which are two very different things. And I think they just spend a little bit too much time on that. And I also would have loved some interviews with people from the Canucks, whether actual players or management, ownership, whoever it is. We get like a 30-second interview with Roberto Luongo, the goalie, at the very, very beginning of the movie, and then they never cut back to him again. And the whole time I'm like, oh, what's Luongo going to have to say about this? What's Luongo going to say about this? And we get nothing in terms of that. And that was a little disappointing, just because as someone who's also seen The Grizzly Truth, you can attest, Kathleen Jamie's able to get interviews with these athletes who clearly have a very cantankerous relationship with the past, and she's able to get them on camera and get their insight. And it would have been very interesting. I'm sure the Canuck players don't want to talk about this riot, but I'm sure there was at least one person that would have agreed to be on camera to be like, hey man, those riots sucked and we were really embarrassed and it really hurt everything that we were trying to do for this city, sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I wonder also how much of it is the NHL's media training that would also hinder the directors from getting like a really good interview with the players or the staff. Like the one good thing about the Grizzly Truth is the players that she talks to saw her previous film about Big Country Reeves and had respect for that, but also the NBA players tend to be personalities in their own right. So they have a they're not afraid to express themselves, whether you like what they have to say or not. Whereas hockey players are very robotic in their response because they all have the same media training. Oh, it was a good game, but we just got to follow the system, play hard, play hard. Oh, you lost the Stanley Cup. How do you feel? Oh, it hurts, but next year we just follow the system, play hard. And, they say the same thing. Like, they never give you any good responses, and that's always driven me mad. Like that's why you don't really see them talking too much about any type of social issue because they very much just stick to the script, so but yeah, that sounds awesome. I'm definitely writing that one down to check out.
Yeah, this one's going to be real easy to find. I know, I'm pretty sure it's on Disney Plus. They've been uploading a lot of the older 30 for 30 seasons, so it might be a couple years before this one airs, but I'm sure it's going to be readily accessible for a lot of people to watch. And if you're a hockey fan in general, or just a Canadian that remembers the riot, I think this is going to be a real fascinating one for people to check out. All right, Courtney, what's one that you kind of want to talk about?
One that I want to talk about that I saw at Hot Docs. I guess it played Sundance, but I missed it, and it was called A Still Small Voice. And this film, it was directed by Luke Lorentzen. My apologies if I mispronounced the name, because those who have listened to my other programs know I'm horrible with names, so I apologize for that. But this film, it was actually a really interesting look at the healthcare system during the COVID pandemic. And I know, we're kind of coming out of the dark days of the pandemic and people don't want to, think about that or see films about the pandemic. But this one actually approaches it from a really fascinating standpoint because it doesn't talk about the doctors or nurses, but it looks at what life was like during the pandemic through the eyes of the support workers, specifically the people that worked as like chaplains within hospitals. So the film is set at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, and it's following these individuals that are part of their chaplain residency program. And it's a program that I guess was established and supervised by this man by the name of Reverend David Fellner. And he had been supervising the program for 6 years. So now we're following as one of the students, Margaret, is going through her residency. She's of Jewish descent, but I guess when you're a chaplain at a hospital, you're essentially kind of skilled in all forms of religion. We see her at one point having to do like a baptism for a baby that has died during childbirth, and she's kind of rushing to grab the Bible and figure out what parts to use. And what's fascinating about this film is you see these individuals as they are tending to patients. So they're not just praying with them, but they're chatting with them. They essentially have to be like that kind of upbeat support. They have to be the ones that will talk about, how do you feel about your diagnosis, and, really taking on a lot of people's problems and weight on their shoulders while also living through a pandemic. So as you see them with patients, then they have their little kind of group residency sessions where they're all talking, and they really kind of start off with this, what I like to call new age approach to listening. So it's like, Dakota, I hear you when you say you were upset about the Vancouver riots. And I feel that, that kind of open dialogue. But as the film goes on, that starts to flow away. And especially Margaret and her supervisor, David, they start butting heads because Margaret's getting very exhausted, overwhelmed, and she's starting to kind of break protocol. Like, for example, she's going to be late for work, but she calls it in an hour after she should have been there. And she doesn't like how the supervisor responds. So instead of like dealing with him, she goes straight to HR, which causes a lot of tension. On top of that, the staff is overworked. People are coming in, they're dealing with all these people who are dying, who are really sick. They interviewed one woman in the film you see Maddie talking to one woman in the film where she came in for one thing. And in the process of being for that one thing, she got COVID at the hospital, had this problem. And so you end up having like 4 problems and she's still in the hospital.
Yeah.
So these are all the things that they're seeing day to day. And you're seeing how it's taking its toll on them, to the point where even the supervisor, David, is kind of like, I'm tired of doing this residency with these people. Like he's at his wit's end. The people he's training are at their wit's end. And the whole world is kind of going through this global pandemic, but we're not thinking about how to best serve the people that are working at the hospitals. It's a really fascinating film. And even though it doesn't specifically talk about it, you walk away from this film understanding why the Great Resignation happened during, I guess, the second year of the pandemic, because you see why people who were just burned out and realized life is so short and unpredictable, especially as this pandemic showed us. Why am I killing myself for a job that is not showing me the respect or love for all the effort that I'm putting in? So it's one of those things where you just kind of walk away looking at the healthcare system in a completely different way. And it's not just the usual pay the nurses more and pay the doctors more, which they really should, or the political talking points. You're just literally seeing and observing the people that had to deal with it day in and day out, that were support workers that no one really talked about or thought about. So it's a really fascinating film, and it's called A Still Small Voice. As I said, it played Sundance. I guess it's now at Hot Docs, and I'm sure it'll probably get a release somewhere soon. I don't know if it's still going to play the festival circuit or if it might get like a streaming release on a platform, but definitely one to look out for.
Interesting. Yeah, that sounds very interesting. It's a shame I wasn't able to catch it. I've always found, as a non-religious person, the concept of chaplains to be a sort of a curious thing. And when you think about it enough, you're like, oh yeah, I guess that like it makes sense that, people who are religious, their faith is important to them, and they're probably very scared and panicked as they are, in a hospital and possibly dying. And having a religious person to talk to, like a chaplain, is probably very comforting. So it's sort of interesting to sort of hear what the modern role of a chaplain may be in today's society.
Yeah, and then with this film, there's an interesting aspect to Margaret, or Maddie as she's called, where because of what she's experiencing, she's also kind of questioning her own faith. Like, there's a really interesting scene where she has to call the loved ones of someone who died in the hospital. And the loved one wasn't able to see them because of the pandemic and restrictions. And there's a lot of guilt on the survivor's guilt, if you will. And Maddie is talking to this woman about that. And then she asks her about her own thoughts on death. And Maddie has to break it down by both, well, in the Jewish faith, death is looked at as this. For me, I look at it like this. And throughout the film, you kind of see her kind of struggling with her own faith. And some of the other individuals, some embrace it even further during the pandemic, and some start to question why certain things happen. There's a patient that she speaks to that talks about, I guess she was smoking for 30 years or something, and then stopped for 20 and ended up getting lung cancer. But her mother and brother smoked their entire lives and never had any type of cancer or ailments, right? And just how, the fairness
Where's the fairness in that,
of things, right? And then when you think of like religion and faith, and how you incorporate these inequities that occurred on a daily basis, it was a really fascinating look. And regardless of whether someone's religious or not religious, you're going to find a lot of interesting takeaways from this film.
Mm-hmm. Was this film shot sort of like in a very fly on the wall, the camera is just there to observe, or were there like talking head interviews?
No, it was all fly on the wall. You're just observing things. I think about, there was no talking head interviews. You're literally just watching individuals talk to each other. So you're in the little residency group sessions where they're talking about their day, the stresses of what they've learned. You see them as they're doing like little yoga meditative things to kind of keep morale up. You're following Maddie as she's going from like patient to patient. But yeah, there's no, and I think also what I liked about it, it's just, you just get to observe what's occurring, and then you have to formulate your own opinions on it. And when you're seeing tensions rise and communications break down, you start to look, well, is Maddie overreacting here? Was David actually too harsh in his assessment over there? It's just a really unique look. And I think because there's no talking heads, it allows you to delve deeper into the film. There's nothing that kind of pulls you away, or you go, oh, I don't like that person. Like here, you feel like you're in the hospital with them. Yeah.
That's fair. Nice. Okay. And very interesting. And then the last film that I want to talk about on my own, I'm only going to say the full title once because I'm definitely going to be mispronouncing it. It is Aitamaako'tamisskapi Natosi, Before the Sun.
Being with my horses, I really feel like they feel my energy, my emotions. They're my home. I feel like there's definitely like more eyes on me because I'm a girl.
These are the fastest horses in the world.
It's an extremely dangerous sport.
Look at Red Curl, the old sun in the blue and gold. Whoa, this is going to be close.
So I definitely butchered the first part of that title, but it is directed by Banshee Hanus. Also, I hope I pronounced the director's name correctly there. And it is about a young woman who lives in Siksika territory, which is she's Blackfoot, out in Alberta, and she lives on a ranch with her parents. I think she is a late teenager when this movie is being filmed, and she likes doing what is called Indian relay races. And so what that encompasses is you do 3 laps around a track, but each lap you switch horses, but the whole time you are doing it bareback with no saddle. So this is incredibly exhilarating and dangerous sport where you're racing. There's 4 racers at a time. And so you've got horses running, which just starting with that, you've got some dangerousness. And the fact that you're doing it bareback, which I imagine takes quite a bit of training to get comfortable with that, because even if anyone's ever sat on a saddle of a horse, it's not exactly a comfortable thing to do. And then you have to literally bring the horse in like it's, an F1 pit, and you jump off one horse, hopefully not startling it, as you then go running, hurtling towards your next horse, where you have to jump onto what is essentially like an 8-foot jump, getting onto a full-grown horse, and then speed off to do your next lap. And it is absolutely fascinating to watch. The angle that this documentary takes is Indian relay racing is strictly a male sport. As in they don't prohibit women from doing it, but only men do it. So it is by default a men's sport. And so we get to see the very first race that we see, Logan Red Crow is the young girl's name. It is at the Calgary Stampede. And of course, the Calgary Stampede, if you know anything about the world of rodeoing, it is the place to be in North America for the best rodeo events. And so she unfortunately loses the race pretty handily to the 3 male competitors she is up against in her heat. And then it's sort of as she's trying to get to be a better racer and understand herself as a racer and what she needs to do. And eventually, as the movie progresses, smaller rodeo announces that they will do a women's portion of the competition. So it'll be the very first time that they have a men's and women's Indian relay racing to sort of change how the racers are able to participate. And so for the first time, she's able to compete against people that are maybe closer in line with her skill set than some of the much larger men that she had to face at the Calgary Stampede. This movie is gorgeously shot. We get some really beautiful, action scenes of Logan riding her horses and all this sort of stuff. And then, of course, we get the very traditional takes of her parents, who are ranchers, want Logan to go to school and have a job better than them. Even though ranching does make the family a decent amount of money, they want a easier job, easier career path for her. And Logan sort of fighting that of wanting to be a rancher herself and be a full-time horse racer as well, and all that sort of stuff that we normally get with, teens wanting to choose their own destiny, young people wanting to choose their own destiny versus their parents who feel they know what the best course of action is. And then she's also sort of fighting against the concept of she struggles to race because she is a young woman and the avenues for her to participate is very difficult. The movie gets a little repetitive in terms of repeating its themes over and over again, which, is just because maybe the movie's an hour and a half, and so to stretch things out, they sort of rehash a lot of the same arguments of, Logan arguing with her parents and her, describing how she feels about the difficulty of facing against other men and how she wishes there was a female component to the race and all this sort of stuff. So it gets a little repetitive in that sense, but the movie is so beautifully shot, and I know nothing about rodeoing, so this was all brand new to me, and just sort of seeing this just was pretty eye-opening of understanding what it means to have such a connection with a horse. It was just very interesting to watch.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. And one of the things I like about documentaries in general is that you get to learn about sports that you didn't even know were occurring. Like when I think about the Calgary Stampede, I think of like bull riding, the little lassoing of whatever the baby cattle, but I never thought of that. Like that sounds really fascinating to me. Like I remember seeing a documentary on, I think it's called Nine Ball, which is like a Filipino version of, I want to say volleyball. That was really fascinating. And I didn't even realize that we have tons of those leagues here in Toronto. But it was just, again, that sport I'd never heard of. Or last year, I think it was the last year at Hot Docs, I saw a film on pigeon racing. And again, I didn't know that was a thing. And I also didn't realize it was like massive, big money, worldwide competition type of event. Yeah, pigeon racing is huge. So, when we often think about documentaries, we tend to think about like films about, big gravitas subjects or pain and emotion. It's like sometimes you can get a really enriching emotional film that's about a sport you've never heard of.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, you're right about that. And I think these racers, obviously I don't think doing a bareback relay horse race is easy by any stretch of the imagination. But when you watch professionals do it, there's a certain ease and grace to it all where you're just like, okay, yeah, like I don't think I personally could do it, but it doesn't, look that hard. And then probably about 3/4 of the way through the film, they sort of start exploring one of Logan's fears is falling on these horses. And we see a montage of people doing this relay race, falling off of their horses, getting trampled by horses, horses bumping into each other and, both rider and horse, going down and the rider being crushed under a horse and all this sort of stuff. And we see a clip of Logan herself falling off the horse. Luckily, it was not that bad of a fall, but she was still completely cut up from head to toe with some pretty big bruises on her face. And then suddenly, for the rest of the movie, you now have that in the back of your head of any time Logan or someone else gets on a horse is, I really hope there isn't an accident, because now there's this inherent sense of fear in me watching this. And sure enough, in the final race we see, which is the ultimate race, which is the women's heat that she's participating in, one of the other riders falls off her horse. And so instantly you're just like, oh my God, is she okay? What's going on here? Like, is both the horse and the woman okay? What's going on? And you have people that like have to hold the horses for you, because obviously when you're racing 3 horses, you need someone there to control the horses that are not in use at the moment. So it's just sort of adding that layer of danger sort of gives you the appreciation for what these athletes are doing as well.
So you have that danger, but then you also have that choreography, because I guess I'm assuming it's a timing thing also with the other people holding the horses that you need to be able to transfer to. Wow, that sounds really good. I'll have to write that one down as well.
Yeah, that's the nice thing.
You've had some good recommendations. So those both, the ones that you've mentioned, both sounded really interesting.
Okay. Well, speaking of good recommendations, what is your last recommendation or one you want to talk about?
I'm going to talk about one that won a couple of awards at Hot Docs, and it was one that grew on me as I was watching it, and it's a film called The Mountains. It's directed by Christian, I believe it's Ian Show. My apologies again for mispronouncing the name, but it won the Best International Feature Documentary Award at Hot Docs this year, and also the Emerging International Filmmaker Award. And this is a film where Christian is essentially using, I guess, 30 years of home videos, and I think it was 75,000 family photographs to construct this portrait of his family, and specifically the men in his family as they essentially got torn apart because of grief. So the film starts off and you think it's going to be a kind of one of those quirky films where the director's just kind of minding his own family footage for the sake of telling the story. And it starts off with Christian, his brother Alex, and his brother Fred all standing, and they're all wearing these superhero costumes, and they're standing in front of like mountains or whatnot. And you're thinking, oh, okay, this is going to be one of those quirky films. But actually what turns out is a really engaging meditation on masculinity and men's inability to communicate when tragedy occurs. So he takes us back to his youth when he and his brother Fred were young, and they had another brother, Christoph. But Christoph, while the family was away on a trip because of their dad's work, becomes ill. And that kind of changes the course of the family, because his dad gets a camera. It's an illness that Christoph is not going to survive from. So he starts filming every moment he can with Christoph for memories. And that's essentially how like the camera comes into the household, and Christian starts learning about documentation. But the camera is never really used for anyone else in the family. It's only if they're interacting with Christoph. And after Christoph passes, the father puts away the camera, and everyone kind of doesn't know how to deal with the grief of Christoph passing. And a year later, Christian's brother Alex is born. And as the film progresses and everyone gets older, you realize that even someone like Alex, who wasn't there when Christoph was alive, is scarred by the reverberations of the death, because as he mentions at one point in the film, he felt like everyone had bonded because of this event that he was never a part of. And now that he's older, he's gone to the Arctic Circle to study because he wants to be as far away from the family as possible. Christian hasn't seen his family in years. His brother Fred is a workaholic, and he's in another region of the world. And it's like everyone is just separated. But what brings them back together is that there's a chance that the father might sell the family home. And that kind of propels the director to go back home and start to put together the threads, and why did everyone separate after the passing of his younger brother. And you get a really interesting portrait into how each man handled grief differently. And like the father used to travel for work, and he really put all his focus into work and travel. His brother Fred, again, as I said, is a workaholic. He's now dealing with going through a divorce and also not knowing how to communicate. And Alex also doesn't know how to communicate. And slowly you see Christian try and pull the strands in and tie back some of those knots and bring the family together. And it's done in such a way that if he didn't put so much investment into letting us spend time with each male member and really understand their unique approach to life and the trauma that they're all bundling up inside, you would think, oh, it's a little too quirky. Like there's some scenes where literally you'll have Christian and one of his brothers running in a field in their Superman costume, almost kind of like recreating moments of their childhood. But because you've spent so much time and invested in these individuals, it actually feels authentic and organic, opposed to, oh, they clearly just probably staged this for film sake. So it's a really interesting film that I was a little skeptical at first just because of the techniques that were being used. But by the end, I was like, okay, no, he's actually earned it. He's found a way to use a lot of these common documentary tropes and make a really interesting and engaging film. My one complaint is that even though it's a film about fathers and sons and a film about masculinity, the mother is almost like non-existent in this film. And she was there for Christoph's passing. You know, the trauma impacted her as well. It impacts the dynamics between the mother and the father of the family, but we don't really see that much of her throughout this film. And I feel that, especially in this day and age, we should be making more films about masculinity, but including women, because they play such a vital role in it. And also the way how, like, I would have loved to hear the mother's perspective on essentially not just her conflicts with the husband, but what it was like to see all of her kids essentially run away in some form. You know, how did that change her? How did that make her more hardened? You know, like we can't keep having films about men that's just focus on men without the impact of our guardedness or our inability to feel, and not talk about its impact on the women around us. So I wish that there was a little more of that. But I will say, as it stands, The Mountains is a really engaging film that it earns the awards and praise that it's been getting.
Nice. Yeah, that was a movie I got several press releases from, and the image of them in like their superhero costumes always kind of made me a little bit curious, but the log line never really drew me in enough to actually want to watch it. But I'm glad to hear that it is actually a very good film and worthy of the praise it's getting, and I'm happy to hear that it did win Best Film.
Yeah, definitely got the international award. And, you know, I think it's a smart move to use the image of them in the superhero costumes, partly because it will attract a lot of people who are like big into Marvel, DC, thinking that it might be X when it's really not X. It's a completely different film. Like the costumes are more in relation to them when they're younger. There's a lot of photos with them pretending to be superheroes and whatnot, but it also kind of gives you that quirky Wes Anderson type vibe where you're like, oh, this is going to be one of those kind of oddball stories, and it's really not that either. So from a marketing standpoint, I think it's a smart move to use that image. But as you said, the log line reads something completely different, and that's the difference is what you're actually going to get from this story. It's more of an emotional journey than anything.
Nice. Okay. Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, I'll definitely have to keep that on my radar and see what happens with this movie going along the line. I think that's the nice thing about Hot Docs is basically everything you watch, you sort of wonder what is going to be the life cycle of this movie. Is it going to pop up on a streaming service? Is it going to get a big theatrical release? Is it going to be nominated at the Oscars? And so it's always interesting because sometimes it'll be 2 years later that I watch a movie at Hot Docs, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, now coming to theaters is this movie." I'm like, oh, "Wow, okay, good. I'm glad someone is actually going to see this movie, and there's going to be an audience for it." But it's sort of funny the life that documentaries eventually take.
Yeah, it's so unpredictable, and I think the one good thing is that we live in the age of streaming now, where I don't know about you, but I've noticed a lot more films that I'm seeing at Hot Docs and other festivals are hitting streaming a lot faster. And they're generating a lot more award buzz because, they might be getting like the limited release here and there, but the minute they hit streaming, more people are talking about it. So I think that's one of the good avenues for a lot of films in terms of people who wouldn't normally go out to watch documentaries are now starting to sit and digest them through the streaming platform. Again, if you can see them in theaters, even better, but there's some areas that only have multiplexes that are only showing Guardians in like 5 of the 8 theaters. It's just the unfortunate nature, but I think more people would be willing to take a shot on a documentary if they're seeing, like, as we saw during the pandemic, Tiger King, even though it was a documentary series, that thing blew up when everyone was at home because, and people started diving into like true crime docs and a lot more. So there is more avenues, I think, for people to see docs than there would, I would argue, even when I first started covering the festival.
Nice. Yeah, if Satan Wants You was turned into a series and they explored the full satanic panic, I would be totally there for that because the directors really nailed it.
Yes, definitely. And I think that's one that people are gonna. I think that will do very well, whether it's in theaters or streaming. I think people are gonna definitely be talking about that one.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think that was a great discussion we had. Courtney, I'm so happy you came on the show. I think we had a great back and forth there. I'm glad we were able to talk about 2 movies we both saw and then share a couple more. So thank you so much for giving me your time today.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. If you ever need a guest, just send out the bat signal and I shall come running.
I will put the bat signal up on the mountains and hopefully you can see it from out there in Toronto. I'm definitely going to have you back. That's absolutely for sure. But if people want to read your work or follow you, what is the best avenue to do that? And is there anything you want to plug as well?
They can usually read my stuff at thatshelf.com. I freelance for POV magazine, so I have a couple of Hot Docs reviews up there. And for their print issue, I wrote a piece where I interviewed the directors of Sonara, which was a film playing at Hot Docs. And that issue is actually available for free online, so you could check that out at povmagazine.com. If you're one of those social media users, I'm at Small Mind on Twitter, and I believe at Small Mind on Spoutable. Those are the 2 social media apps I probably use the most. I'm also on Instagram, but I don't update it as regularly. And in terms of things that are coming up, I have a review of Blackberry that I should hopefully have up maybe on Cinema Access by May 12th, I think, when that film comes out. And also, I'm going to be on a couple of episodes of A Year in Film, which is on the Hollywood Suites channel. I believe it's coming out, the new season's coming out in May, so I don't have the exact date, but I know it's coming soon, so I'll probably be on 1 or 2 episodes of that talking about movies from different eras.
Nice. That's really exciting. Well, I'll make sure to link to your socials and to where people can find your work as well in the show notes. But yeah, once again, thank you so much, Courtney.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Well, this has been a That Shelf podcast. Visit thatshelf.com for more great film discourse. You can follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at contrazoompod. Did you see anything during the Hot Docs? Let us know. Send an email to contrazoompod@gmail.com. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there as well. And if you really like the show, consider tipping us on coffee. Thanks for checking us out.